Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back into the chilling, echoing halls of a massive Victorian manor, a place where the smells of polished brass and burning coal mingle with the faint, lingering scent of last night's roasted pheasant. You are not the master or the mistress of this grand house, I'm afraid. You are simply a blur, a ghost in the green baize door, gliding silently between the gaslit drawing rooms and the dark, perpetually busy realm of the basement kitchens. You eat it standing up or perch quickly on a hard bench. There's no leisurely reading of the morning paper for you. You have about 10 minutes before the real work begins. This heavy labor requires substantial calories, but their position in the hierarchy often means they receive the meager rations, a smaller scoop of gruel, a thinner slice of bread, and certainly fewer lumps of meat in the stew. Their constant gnawing hunger is a profound reality of their job. They operate in a state of perpetual caloric deficit. This physical need often translates into desperate measures, leading to the practice of sneaky, minor pilfering of food. This wasn't necessarily organized theft, which was heavily punished, but rather opportunistic, momentary grabs driven by sheer hunger. Imagine you are the scullery maid, tasked with cleaning up after the master's late-night supper. The dining table has been cleared, but there might be a few uneaten bits of crust left on a bread plate, or perhaps a dollop of gravy clinging to the side of a serving bowl. This is gold. The mainstream historical fact here is that many working-class children in service learned very quickly how to consume evidence. They would scrape the last remnants of food from plates before washing them, a technique known sometimes as plate scraping, a dangerous but necessary supplement to their diet. A quirky tidbit is the particular focus on sugar. Sugar was an expensive prize commodity. It provided an immediate, intense burst of energy and flavor. A scullery maid tasked with fetching sugar from the locked caddy might quickly dip a clean fingertip into the barrel for a tiny, immediate dose of sweetness, or perhaps lick the sugar dust from the outside of a canister. This minor act of theft was both a caloric and a psychological boost, breaking the constant monotony of salt and starch. The danger of this is real. If the cook or the butler caught a maid pilfering, the consequences were severe, ranging from immediate dismissal without a reference, which was a death sentence for a job seeker, to physical punishment. This is why the snacks had to be hidden. A small, cold, congealed potato, tucked into a pocket during the clearing of the dining room and eaten later in the dark scullery, was a risky act of self-preservation. You, as a housemaid higher up the ladder, might see the desperation in the eyes of the junior staff. You might even deliberately leave a small crust of bread near the edge of a table for the boot boy, a tiny, unspoken act of solidarity. Historians still argue whether the infant mortality rates among the children born to these impoverished domestic servants were directly linked to the poor nutritional status and low-calorie diets of the mothers during their service years, suggesting that the hunger had generational consequences. As you fold the clean linens for the next day, you recall the cold salt cod from yesterday. Even though it was unappetizing, it was at least a proper, allocated meal. The scullery maid's existence is defined by the uncertainty of their next bite, a constant negotiation with authority and appetite. It's a profound difference. You eat the boring food that's allotted to you, but the lowest staff eat the food they risk their job for. It's a constant low-grade stressor that adds to the already crushing physical labor. Accompanying the gruel will be slices of bread, not the white, fluffy, refined stuff the master enjoys later. This is often the tough, crusty, heavy brown bread, sometimes a day or two old, designed to last and to be filling. And to go with the bread? Not butter, no. That's reserved for the dining room. Your spread is usually dripping, the solidified fat rendered down from the previous day's cooked meat. It's stored in a stone jar and has a savory, slightly greasy taste. You hear the distinct sound of the scullery maid dropping a stack of plates, a nervous exhaustion showing. You quickly move to assist her, if only to save her from the cook's inevitable wrath. Remembering that feeling of dull, persistent hunger that she must feel 10 times worse than you do. Having consumed your risky, low-calorie Saturday meals and successfully navigated the subtle power dynamics of the kitchen, your attention now shifts to hydration. A diet heavy in salt, starch, and preserved fish creates intense thirst, yet accessing clean, safe drinking water in a Victorian city was a constant, terrifying gamble. This brings us to water, beer, and tea, the Victorian beverage menu. For the vast majority of Victorian servants, reaching for a glass of plain water was an act of faith or sheer desperation. The communal water supplies in cities were notoriously contaminated, often mixing with raw sewage, a mainstream historical fact you desperately wished wasn't true, every time you felt a pang of stomach cramp. If you lived in a house without a dedicated clean well or filtering system, drinking the local water was a direct invitation to cholera, typhus, or general, debilitating malaise. You knew dozens of people who had been violently ill, and you knew the cause was often what they drank. This environmental reality is why small beer was the preferred and often safer default drink. Small beer wasn't the strong, intoxicating ale you might think of. It was a weak, low-alcohol brew, sometimes as little as 1% ABV, made from the second running of the mash. The process of boiling the water during brewing killed the harmful bacteria, making it a safer option than plain, untreated water. You drink it with breakfast, dinner, and supper, and even during breaks. It was cheap, slightly nutritious, and often more palatable than the hard, stale water from the communal pump. It provided a small, constant caloric bump and was drunk by the gallon by the heavy labor workers, like the footmen and coachmen. The other essential beverage, one that provided both warmth and a social moment, was tea. The consumption of tea exploded during the Victorian era. For the servants, the tea was almost always the cheapest quality available. The very dust and sweepings of the tea chests, sometimes mixed with other ingredients to bulk it out. It was brewed very strong, often served without milk until the master's milk was delivered, and sometimes sweetened with cheap brown sugar or treacle if the cook allowed. The warmth was a psychological comfort, and the mild caffeine boost was essential for pushing through the long afternoon slump. A quirky tidbit related to tea is its impact on the social life of the female staff. The daily communal tea break, however brief, was one of the few permitted moments of social interaction and rest for the maids and kitchen staff. It was often where gossip was exchanged, complaints were whispered, and solidarity was silently established. It was a brief, precious moment of you time, funded by cheap leaf dust and boiled water. The men, particularly the outdoor staff, often preferred their small beer or sometimes cider if available. They needed the heavier calories and weren't always privy to the domestic ritual of the tea break. You watched the scullery maid boiling the enormous copper kettle over the range. Boiling water, even for weak tea, was another layer of protection. It provides much-needed calories for the physical labor ahead, but it's a far cry from a modern, refined spread. It's just grease, salt, and flavor, and yet it's your primary source of fat. That's your first meal of the day: gruel, brown bread, and dripping. A mainstream historical fact is that this simple carbohydrate-heavy breakfast provided over half the daily calories for many servants, and that's because they were burning it all off. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of small beer and tea had a net positive or negative effect on the health of the Victorian working class. While the boiling process made the drinks safer from bacterial contamination, the heavy tannins in the strong tea and the sugar often added led to rampant dental decay and other issues. For you, it's a non-choice. You drink the small beer for safety and the weak tea for warmth and energy, knowing that the pure, cold, beautiful water you crave might contain a deadly sickness. You accept the chipped ceramic mug of dark, strong tea from the maid and sip it quickly. It is bitter, warm, and comforting. The taste reminds you of home, wherever that might have been before you entered service. You know you need to conserve the small beer until later in the day, but the tea is a necessary bridge from the morning's gruel to the midday's leftover stew. Hydration is not a matter of taste. It's a matter of immediate function and long-term survival against the invisible enemies in the water mains. The week is almost over, and you are running on the sheer momentum of habit and starch. Now that we've covered the what and why of your food, let's clarify the when. The Victorian era featured a great deal of confusion around meal times and names, particularly between the master's schedule and the servants. This brings us to dinner versus supper, naming conventions and times. Understanding these terms is crucial to understanding the rhythm of your day. For the master and mistress upstairs, the main fashionable meal of the day had gradually shifted later and later in the century. By the 1880s, their large multi-course feast, known formally as dinner, might not be served until 7:30 p.m. or even 8 p.m. Before that, around 1 p.m., they would have a smaller, more informal meal, often called luncheon. For you, the servants, this was flipped, or at least the terminology was simpler and tied directly to necessity. Your main substantial meal of the day, the one that provided the bulk of your calories and energy, was eaten around midday, usually between 12:30 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. You called this meal dinner. This is where you consume the cold joint remnants on Monday or the heavy filling stew on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. This timing was dictated entirely by practicality. It was the brief lull between the heavy morning chores, cleaning, setting fires, fetching water, and the preparation for the family's afternoon and evening schedule. Setting the table, running errands, lighting lamps. The evening meal, eaten late after the family had finished their grand dinner and you had finished clearing and washing up, was your supper. This typically happened quite late, often after 9 p.m. or even closer to 10 p.m., especially if the family was entertaining or holding a late social engagement. This meal was generally light, intended to stave off hunger during the few hours before you finally collapsed into bed. It might be nothing more than a bowl of leftover cold gruel or porridge, a reprise of breakfast perhaps, some dry bread with dripping, or maybe a simple cup of tea with a slice of cake if the cook was rewarding the staff for a particularly busy day. It was minimal, quick, and silent. You scraped the last bit of sticky oatmeal from your bowl. Time to start the fires in the master's study. The quirky tidbit here is that sometimes the cook, who has supreme power over your fate and portions, might put some treacle, a kind of molasses, into the gruel on a Sunday morning. A minor, almost imperceptible luxury designed to keep the staff marginally happier before the long, demanding day of the main event. A mainstream historical fact is that this shift in dining times was a clear social marker. As the wealthy adopted later dinner times, it created a greater gap between the master's meals and the staff's meals, physically separating the classes even more, which required more labor as you had to manage two separate meal schedules. The brief window allocated for your midday dinner was sacrosanct, not because of luxury, but because of survival. You had to eat fast, and you had to eat enough to sustain you through the next 9 hours. Historians still argue whether the late timing of the servants' supper, forcing them to eat just before bed after a day of physical exhaustion, contributed to chronic digestive issues. Eating heavy, starchy food so late, then immediately sleeping, was far from ideal, but the schedule permitted no other time. A quirky tidbit about the formality of meals, even downstairs, is the hierarchy within the servants' hall itself. The higher-ranking staff, like the butler, the housekeeper, and the cook, often sat at the head of the table. They were served first and sometimes enjoyed marginally better portions, maintaining that strict, layered hierarchy even during the brief respite of eating. The lower-ranking maids and footmen often had to wait until these senior staff were served before they could start, even if the food was already cooling. You find yourself subtly checking the clock on the kitchen wall, anxiously timing your meal to ensure you are ready the moment the master's first bell rings, signaling the next wave of evening duties. You remember that cold, half-eaten breakfast from section 2, a reminder that the master's time is always more important than your appetite. You must finish quickly. With the confusing schedule of dinner versus supper now clarified, let's pivot to the most telling, most painful difference in the Victorian house: the food itself. We are now going to examine the stark contrast of upstairs versus downstairs, a calorie and quality divide. This wasn't just about taste, it was about nutrition, health, and a tangible measurement of social worth. You as a servant subsist on a diet that is overwhelmingly starch and fat heavy. Remember the gruel, the brown bread, the potatoes, the stews, and the ever-present dripping. This diet is highly functional. It provides volume and bulk, which satisfies the stomach's stretch receptors, and it offers the necessary fuel to perform physically demanding labor. However, it is chronically low in variety and certain key nutrients. You rarely, if ever, see fresh, soft, green vegetables outside of the occasional boiled cabbage. Boiled to death, of course, or fresh fruit. Now imagine the master's table. The meal is a multi-course spectacle, a French-influenced dîner à la Russe. It might begin with delicate consommé, followed by a fish course, perhaps salmon or turbot with elaborate sauces, then the grand main course of a perfectly roasted joint or feathered game, served with a dozen different, lightly steamed or butter-sautéed seasonal vegetables. After that, there might be a savory course, and finally a dessert course of delicate pastries, fresh summer berries, or elaborate custards. A mainstream historical fact is that the sheer volume and variety of food consumed by the upper classes led to widespread issues of obesity and gout, diseases virtually unknown in the servants' hall, where physical labor burned off every available calorie. But for now, on this typical Tuesday morning, it's just the bland, heavy filler, a fuel-grade meal that tells you exactly where you stand. You are the invisible machine, and this food is the cheap, necessary coal. That heavy feeling of the oatmeal, the slight stickiness in your mouth from the cheap grain, is what you carry with you as you begin the relentless grind of the morning. The quality divide is astonishing. The master eats protein-rich meals featuring refined cuts of meat, eggs, dairy, and a wide variety of fresh produce, often sourced from the house's own expensive glass houses or delivered fresh daily. The servant eats carbohydrate-rich meals featuring offcuts, cheap salted fish, and root vegetables. The caloric intake might be roughly similar. You need fuel for work. They need fuel for conversation. But the nutritional quality is worlds apart. You, the servant, are receiving essential energy, but you are often silently suffering from minor nutritional deficiencies, such as a lack of vitamin C, which contributes to poor gum health and recurring colds. A quirky tidbit that illustrates this contrast is the use of stock. The master's sauces were made from rich, complex stocks, simmered from prime bones, wine, and aromatic vegetables. Your soup, or the base of your stew, was often just pot liquor, the water that cheap vegetables were boiled in, perhaps thickened with a bit of flour. It's the difference between a refined culinary foundation and resourceful water recycling. The visible nature of this disparity is another form of control. As a footman, you literally serve the master a platter of perfectly cooked asparagus, knowing you will later be eating boiled turnips. As a housemaid, you clear plates with uneaten pheasant or half-finished pastries. This proximity to luxury, combined with the personal experience of eating monotonous, inferior fare, adds a psychological weight to the job. It constantly reinforces the immense distance between your two worlds, even though you inhabit the same building. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of tuberculosis among domestic servants was primarily caused by the cramped, poorly ventilated sleeping conditions in the attic or basement rooms, or whether it was exacerbated by their low-variety diet, which compromised their immune systems. It was likely a devastating combination of both factors. You feel the slight, persistent ache in your teeth as you quickly rinse your mouth with weak tea. You remember that cold, tough crust of brown bread from this morning's breakfast, contrasting it with the delicate buttered toast you are currently preparing for the master's afternoon tea. The calorie and quality divide is not just an abstract concept. It is the physical experience of your life, the thing that limits your health, your strength, and your dreams of a longer, easier life. You are literally running on the remnants, the efficient fuel required to keep the grand engine of the house running, while the occupants enjoy the lavish, complex, and nutritionally superior feast. You've digested the sharp social critique offered by the upstairs versus downstairs meals, and now, as the working week draws to a close, it's time to confront the unappetizing truth of what actually constituted the meat component of your diet. The master was served the elegant roasts and chops, the servants received the leftovers and the unglamorous parts of the animal, the food defined by offal and waste, nose-to-tail eating for the staff. The Victorian economy was built on efficiency, and absolutely nothing went to waste, especially in the context of feeding a large staff. When an animal was butchered for the household, the desirable prime cuts, the loins, the joints, the fillets, went straight into the master's larder. The rest, the cheaper, less fashionable, but often highly nutritious organs and extremities, were specifically earmarked for the servants' hall. You've moved from the cold fire grate in the drawing room, covered in soot, to polishing the brass knobs on the front door. The physical demand of the work, climbing stairs hundreds of times a day, hauling coal scuttles, wrestling heavy linens, means that the food you ate 10 minutes ago is already starting to be metabolized, leaving you with that faint, unsettling rumble in your stomach. This early start, the gruel and bread reality that defines your morning, sets the tone for the entire week. Your plate was frequently graced by offal. This term covers the internal organs and less desired parts of the butchered animal. This might include tripe, the stomach lining of a cow or sheep. It has a tough, rubbery texture and must be meticulously cleaned and long cooked, usually boiled or stewed, before it becomes remotely edible. It's often served plain or with a light onion sauce. Lights, the lungs of an animal, particularly a pig or sheep. These were often used to bulk out the midweek stews, adding texture and protein without adding much flavor, unless heavily seasoned. Ox cheek and oxtail. These are tough, muscular cuts full of collagen, requiring hours of slow simmering to become tender. They provided a wonderful, rich depth of flavor to the stew, making the broth savory, but they were almost exclusively reserved for the servants' hall due to their cheapness and the time required for preparation. Heart and kidneys. Occasionally these organs, known for their strong, distinct flavor, would be included in the stew, offering a boost of iron and protein. A mainstream historical fact is that this nose-to-tail eating was actually a very nutritionally sound practice. Offal is typically packed with vitamins, especially B vitamins, and essential minerals like iron, often in higher concentrations than the more desirable muscle meats. The servant's diet, while dull, wasn't necessarily unhealthy in terms of protein and mineral intake, thanks to the necessary inclusion of these cheap cuts. The psychological hurdle, however, was significant. You, the servant, are constantly preparing and serving refined food to the master, while you are eating the parts of the animal most people found visually repulsive or simply too chewy. You remember that tough piece of Monday meat in Section 3? Sometimes that was the beginning of the offal cycle. A quirky tidbit is the use of faggots, particularly in more rural or northern households. These were balls of ground-up offal, often liver and heart, mixed with breadcrumbs, herbs, and onions, wrapped in caul fat, the membrane that surrounds internal organs, and baked. They were the ultimate in efficient, cheap food utilization, turning scraps into a calorie-dense, if heavy, meal. As you look at your portion of the day's dinner, You might be chewing on a piece of gristle-laced meat, or perhaps a section of tripe. You eat it because you have to. Every calorie counts toward the next 5 hours of scrubbing and polishing. Historians still argue whether the perceived inferiority of offal perpetuated the class divide, or if the master's avoidance of these highly nutritious parts was simply a function of changing upper-class tastes that favored presentation over practicality. The upper classes considered strong-tasting, chewy food to be coarse, something acceptable only for the manual laborer. It's a diet of functionality, not enjoyment. You finish your dinner, scraping the last bits of the heavy stew from your bowl. It's Saturday, and the need to clear out the larder is paramount. You are already anticipating the brief comparative luxury of the Sunday roast, but you know that today's meal, heavy with offal and bone, has given you the necessary iron and strength to complete the grueling final tasks before the supposed day of rest. The house runs on the energy gleaned from the parts the master discards. The reliance on offal and waste has satisfied your immediate caloric needs, but as you trudge through Saturday's final chores, you feel the distinct lack of freshness in your diet. This brings us to a major flaw in the servant's food routine: seasonal variation and the lack of fresh produce. Your diet is characterized by a persistent dullness and a dangerous absence of key vitamins. The master's table was often a reflection of the season, albeit an artificial one. Wealthy households had hothouses and could afford expensive imported goods, so the family might enjoy early strawberries or hothouse grapes, even in the middle of winter. Your reality is far less glamorous. For the staff, food was chosen for its storage life and cost-effectiveness, meaning you existed on a narrow band of resilient, staple ingredients. Your vegetable intake, outside of the midweek stew, was largely limited to root vegetables and cabbage. Think turnips, parsnips, and carrots that had been stored in dark, cool cellars for months. They are robust and cheap, and they survive long periods of storage, but their nutritional value, particularly their vitamin content, diminishes significantly over time. And when they finally made it to your plate, they were subjected to the standard Victorian working-class cooking method, boiling to oblivion. The vegetables were often boiled for an hour or more, primarily to ensure they were soft and easily digestible, but also to save on fuel by cooking them in the same pot water for an extended period. A mainstream historical fact is that this excessive boiling destroyed much of the remaining vitamin C and other water-soluble vitamins, meaning even when you did eat vegetables, you were still teetering on the edge of deficiency. The lack of fresh fruit was particularly acute. Fruit was seen as a luxury item, and if a servant was given any, it was often the windfalls or the slightly bruised pieces deemed unfit for the family's dessert course. This profound absence of fresh, raw food led to common health issues among domestic staff. You feel it most in your mouth, the slight puffiness and tenderness of your gums. The lack of vitamin C, a deficiency that causes scurvy, was an underlying issue. While outright severe scurvy was rare in cities, many servants suffered from subclinical scurvy, manifesting as chronic fatigue, frequent bruising, and the aforementioned gum problems. You also suffer from recurring digestive sluggishness due to the lack of fresh fiber, a side effect of running on dense starches, boiled roots, and rendered fat. Historians still argue whether the increase in available potatoes, which retain vitamin C better than other root vegetables, was the primary factor preventing full-blown scurvy epidemics in the working class, or if it was the sporadic access to small quantities of fresh produce. A quirky tidbit that sometimes appears in accounts is the servant's ingenious method of attempting to get some vitamin C. The brewing of nettle tea or other foraged green teas when they had access to the countryside, or the consumption of the cheapest form of citrus, pickled lemon or orange peel, which provided a strong flavor and a hint of the necessary acid. But these were rare, opportunistic fixes, not part of the daily routine. Let's stay focused on the breakfast for a moment, because its simplicity is deceptive. While the basic components were gruel and bread, the subtle variances tell a story. If the household was very grand and perhaps employed a professional baker on staff, the servant's bread might be made from a decent wholemeal flour, but often it was just the cheapest flour available, sometimes mixed with bran or even other less desirable additions to bulk it out. As you clean the last of the master's silver, reflecting the grand, brightly colored fruit bowls he enjoys, you contrast that visual feast with the bland, dull browns and grays of your week's diet. The kitchen larder for the staff is stacked high with sacks of potatoes and barrels of salted fish, a testament to the fact that longevity and cost determine your menu, not taste or optimal nutrition. This chronic lack of seasonal variation means your meals are virtually identical from January to December, providing reliable calories but failing to provide robust health. You sigh, feeling the weight of the week's labor and the slight ache of your undernourished body, knowing that tomorrow is Sunday, the most exhausting day of the week, but also the day that promises a momentary, if exhausting, upgrade in your evening meal. You've almost made it. Saturday is drawing to a close, and the intense, repetitive, undernourished cycle of the week is reaching its crescendo. This brings us to Saturday's simple meal and anticipating Sunday. The food served on this day is often the plainest of the week, driven by the pragmatic need to clean out the larder and prepare for the massive cooking effort that Sunday demands. The cook, already mentally planning the master's elaborate Sunday roast and the necessary accompanying dishes, is determined not to carry over any perishable supplies into the new week. Saturday's dinner, the main midday meal for the staff, is therefore a culinary cleanup operation. The meal often consists of whatever stale bread, tough ends of cheese, or leftover cooked grains, like rice or dried peas, have accumulated since Monday. You might be served a thin, slightly watery soup made from the final boilings of the week's meat bones, strained and maybe thickened with a handful of oats. It's functional, but utterly forgettable. This deliberate simplicity is a logistical move. A mainstream historical fact is that in larger houses, Saturday was often the day when the master or the housekeeper conducted a thorough inventory of the kitchen and larder supplies, scrutinizing the cook's spending and usage. By serving a meal that visibly utilized the odds and ends, the cook demonstrated efficiency and prevented waste, thus maintaining her good standing. This meant you were literally eating the evidence of the week's leftovers. The most common iteration of Saturday's meal was often a simple bread and cheese supper, served slightly earlier than usual to allow the kitchen staff more time to prep. The bread is tough, perhaps the crusts saved from the week, and the cheese is the cheapest available, often a hard, crumbly, cheddar-like variety, heavily salted to prolong its shelf life. It's a dry, heavily processed meal that provides quick calories but requires a lot of that weak tea or small beer to wash down. A quirky tidbit is the concept of a hash. If there were any small, nondescript pieces of cold meat left from earlier in the week, too little for a proper cold joint slice but too much to throw away, the cook might chop them up finely with boiled potatoes and onions, bind them with a little fat, and fry them briefly into a hash. This was one of the few servant meals that involved any form of quick frying, giving it a fleeting moment of flavor. But the primary purpose was still using up the scraps. You eat quickly, feeling the dull ache of muscle fatigue. The focus now shifts entirely to the Herculean task of anticipating Sunday. Sunday is simultaneously the day of rest and the most demanding day for domestic servants, particularly the kitchen staff. Everything revolves around the centerpiece, the master's Sunday dinner. Imagine trying to slice through something that feels less like bread and more like a hardened sponge. It's dense, chewy, and requires serious jaw effort. It's definitely not the airlight white loaf, called manshed or kissing crust, that the family upstairs enjoys with their silver service. This bread is purely structural. Historians still argue whether the amount of food waste in the upper-class dining room and the subsequent utilization of that waste in the servants' hall was a fair system of resource allocation or a source of deep-class resentment. The fact that the servants were directly dependent on the remnants of the master's extravagance to survive fueled a complex mix of relief and resentment. You remember the crocodile dung sunscreen joke we started with? It was about necessity dictating choices. Here, necessity dictates that you eat the final, plainest meal of the week to clear the decks. Your small supper is done. You now have a few short hours of frenzied preparation, polishing the brass, laying out the fresh linens, and setting the dozens of serving dishes required for the family's grand feast tomorrow. You smell the faint, promising aroma of wood smoke and roasting meat already starting to permeate the air from the kitchen's main range, even though the joint hasn't been put on yet. That smell is a promise of an overwhelming day of work, but also a promise of a small, comparative reward at the very end. You finish your cleaning. The thought of that relatively better Sunday dinner, cold, tough, but real meat, being the only thing pushing you through the last hours of your shift. The relentless week has culminated, and you find yourself in the deep exhaustion of Sunday evening. You've prepared and served the master's iconic feast, the grand multi-course meal requiring hours of basting, carving, and frantic service. Now finally, after the family has retreated to their drawing room for port and cards, the servants are called to their final, significant meal of the week. Sunday dinner, the brief taste of quality and fatigue. This meal is the servant's version of the Sunday roast, and while it is superior to the cold, stringy scrap meats of Monday, it is a reward tempered by utter exhaustion. The whole day has been a blur of high-stakes culinary and service activity, meaning that by the time you sit down, you are physically and mentally drained. The atmosphere in the servants' hall is not one of joyous feasting, but rather of quiet, profound fatigue. What you are served is typically the very last of the roast joint. This might be the bones, which still have savory bits clinging to them, or perhaps the tougher, less sightly parts that were deliberately set aside during the master's carving to ensure a fair portion for the staff. The mainstream historical fact is that the staff dinner was often eaten long after the master's, sometimes hours later, meaning the food was cold or lukewarm by the time it reached your plate. Despite the temperature, this food represents the brief taste of quality. For one meal a week, you get to eat a portion of meat that hasn't been heavily salted, pickled, or boiled to within an inch of its life for a stew. It's roasted meat, seasoned with the same herbs the master enjoyed. It is served with the last of the oven-roasted potatoes, which are infinitely more appealing than the perpetually boiled ones you've consumed all week. If you're lucky, you might even get a spoon of gravy, rich with the juices of the roast. This is the meal you cling to mentally, the one small comparative highlight in a week of monotonous starch and fat. However, the enjoyment is muted by the overwhelming knowledge that the work isn't truly over. As you chew slowly on a piece of mutton, you realize you still have to clear the master's immense dining table, wash dozens of pieces of delicate china, and ensure all the kitchen coppers are scoured. The exhaustion is so deep that the rich food feels almost heavy and difficult to process. And that gruel, while providing necessary warmth and calories, wasn't always a hot commodity, literally speaking. If you were low on the staff hierarchy, a scullery maid or a boot boy, you were often the last to eat. The enormous pot of gruel might be sitting by the kitchen range, cooling rapidly in the damp basement air. By the time it reached your bowl, it might be lukewarm, congealed, and slightly rubbery. You don't complain, of course. Complaint means hunger. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? That necessary evil. This meal is the necessary reward, but it comes at the cost of your Sunday rest. A quirky tidbit is the tradition of the servant's pudding. Sometimes to ensure the staff felt marginally appreciated, or simply to use up the remaining ingredients from the family's dessert, The cook would make a large, hearty pudding for the staff, often a suet pudding, a steamed fruit dumpling, or a bread pudding. This was an incredibly calorie-dense treat, offering a massive dose of sweetness and comfort, a psychological salve for the exhaustion. You savor the sugar, knowing it will be weeks until you get anything similar. Historians still argue whether the Sunday dinner was a genuine attempt by employers to provide a better meal and thus foster loyalty, or if it was simply the most economical use of the week's largest and most expensive food item. Either way, it successfully functioned as the reset button for the cycle. You scrape the last of the gravy from your plate, feeling a brief, rare sense of satiety. The meal is over. The plates are cleared. The small beer is finished. The house is quiet, save for the distant murmur of the master's card game. You trudge back toward the kitchen, ready to face the mountain of washing up that awaits. The taste of roasted meat and the sweetness of the pudding will linger, pushing you through the final hours until you can finally collapse into your cramped bed, ready to awaken to the bland taste of gruel and the dawn of another Monday. The week is done. The work is finally irrevocably done. You've banked your meager wages and your precious calories. The vast, echoing house is settling into the quiet, pervasive darkness. The last gas lamps have been turned down low, leaving long, soft shadows stretching across the polished wooden floors. You are no longer rushing, no longer anticipating the sound of a demanding bell. The only sound is the soft, rhythmic hum of the nearby streets and the almost imperceptible creak of the old timbers of the house cooling down. As you walk slowly up the back staircase to your tiny attic room, let the tension drain from your muscles. Let the persistent, savory taste of the day's meal fade gently from your mind. That heavy, starchy food, the cheap meat, the boiled potatoes, it all served its purpose. It fueled the life of the house, and now that furnace is banked for the night. You are safe from the scrutiny of the master, the demands of the mistress, and the sharp eye of the cook. Feel the thin, cool cotton of the sheet as you pull it up to your chin. The air is still and cool against your face. Close your eyes and just listen to your own slow, steady breath. The work will start again tomorrow. The gruel will be bland. The stairs will be steep. But for now, for this moment, you have done enough. You have survived the unrelenting demands of the Victorian house and its utilitarian diet. Just breathe in and let go of the week's worry and exhaustion. We're going to spend the next week, meal by monotonous meal, tracing exactly what fueled the engine of the British Empire, the working-class stomach, specifically what Victorian servants ate for every meal of the week. A mainstream historical fact is that servants often supplemented their diet by drinking the skimmed milk left over from making butter or cream for the upstairs dining room, if the cook was generous enough to share it instead of selling it off. You are tired, you are safe, and the long, quiet darkness is waiting to cradle you. Sweet dreams, sleep deeply, and forget the taste of salt cod and dripping. The simple addition of dripping to the bread is where you get a necessary, if slightly disgusting, calorie boost. Remember that fat from the previous section? It's basically the savory version of margarine, but without the modern chemicals. It's rendered beef or mutton fat, and it's essential. It coats the stomach and gives you a slow-burning energy release that a bowl of oats alone simply can't provide. If you were extremely lucky, the cook might sometimes stir some finely chopped herbs or a bit of salt into the dripping to make it vaguely palatable. But mostly it's just solid, bland, meaty grease. A quirky tidbit from the era shows that many servants carefully saved any crusts or uneaten slices of bread from breakfast, wrapping them in a piece of cloth to eat during a quick, snatched moment in the mid-morning, perhaps while polishing a grate or peeling potatoes, trying to stretch the energy until their next official meal. The entire ritual of the servant's breakfast emphasizes speed and utility. There's no sitting down for a long chat, no lingering over a hot cup of coffee. Tea is the standard, which we'll discuss later. You are eating fuel for the next 6 hours of heavy labor. It's a transaction, calories in, workout. One of the fascinating scholarly debates surrounding this era is whether the nutritional value was truly sufficient for the sheer amount of physical work required. Historians still argue whether the high starch and fat content adequately prevented deficiencies, or if the lack of fresh fruit and high-quality protein led to widespread, low-level malnutrition among the domestic staff, manifesting as chronic fatigue, dental problems, and recurring infections. You certainly feel tired all the time, regardless of what the historians conclude, and the simple fact that you crave the flavor of something, anything other than warm grain, is a testament to the repetitive nature of your diet. As you finish your bread and dripping, you hear the distant chime from the master's room. It's the first bell. He wants his morning hot water. This means you have to abandon your meal, even if you're only halfway through, and sprint up the back stairs to perform your duty. The unfinished meal will sit, cold and undesirable, waiting for you to sneak a bite if the cook isn't looking, or more likely, it will simply be cleared away by a junior maid who might be hoping for a secret mouthful herself. This constant interruption means that even the simple act of eating is a hurried, anxiety-filled affair. You learn to chew quickly, swallow fast, and prioritize calories over chewing thoroughly, a habit you carry all your working life. The breakfast is done, the day is started, and your stomach is braced for the rest of the week's identical, energy-focused meals. The morning tasks blur together, lugging hot water, emptying chamber pots, sweeping vast carpets, and carrying heavy laundry baskets up and down 3 flights of stairs. You're constantly moving, a silent, gray figure in the background of the master's comfortable life. The early morning sustenance of gruel and bread is steadily burning off, and by the time the church bells strike noon, or perhaps 1 o'clock, you're ready for the main meal of your working day. Dinner. Take a moment right now, wherever you are, to listen to the soft clatter of the scullery. That's your reality now. You've just woken up. Feel the chill of the thin, cotton nightdress and the scratchy horsehair mattress tucked into a cramped attic room you share with 2 other girls, or perhaps in a stuffy basement cubby if you're a male servant. It's barely 5:30 in the morning, and the bell for the master's first cup of tea hasn't even rung yet. But your day started 10 minutes ago. This isn't the formal dinner of the family, which happens much later in the evening. For you, the servants, this midday meal is the crucial refueling stop. And if today is Monday, you know exactly what awaits you in the kitchen. Monday is the day of scraps from the Sunday joint. The iconic Victorian Sunday roast was a centerpiece of the master's culinary week, typically featuring a massive joint of beef, mutton, or perhaps a chicken or goose. The family upstairs would have enjoyed it hot, freshly carved, served with rich gravy, roasted potatoes, and seasonal vegetables. But the sheer size of these joints often meant there were leftovers, and these leftovers, often the least desirable cuts after the initial carving, were the servant's reward for a week of toil. You sit down, probably sharing a long wooden table with your fellow staff. The atmosphere isn't cheerful. It's mostly exhausted silence punctuated by the clatter of forks. What's on your plate is cold, sliced meat. The contrast is stark. The master had the succulent, hot center cuts. You get the tougher ends, the bits close to the bone, or pieces that might be a little overcooked or undercooked from sitting out. This isn't inherently bad meat, but it's certainly not high-quality dining. It's usually served without the rich gravy the family enjoyed. Instead, your cold slice of mutton might be accompanied by the cheap, ubiquitous bulk of the working-class diet: boiled potatoes. Tons of boiled potatoes. The potatoes are the unsung hero of the servant's kitchen. They are calorie-dense, filling, cheap, and easily sourced. They provide the necessary carbohydrates to carry you through the afternoon's work. A mainstream historical fact is that the average working-class individual in Victorian England consumed significantly more potatoes than modern Western diets, relying on them heavily for essential energy. They were often boiled in massive batches, sometimes in the same water repeatedly to save fuel, giving them a slightly flat, waterlogged taste. They are usually served just plain, maybe with a little salt, or perhaps mashed roughly with some of that reserved dripping if the cook is feeling particularly benevolent today. If the master's table was very grand and they finished their vegetables last night, you might also get the leftovers of the vegetable water, the pot liquor, served as a thin, rather unappealing soup. This soup is merely the strained boiling water from the cabbage or carrots, sometimes thickened with a bit of flour or the ends of stale bread. It was a resourceful way to extract every last bit of nutritional value and flavor, or at least that's what the cook told herself. You drink it because you're thirsty and it's warm, not because it tastes good. The quirky tidbit about Monday's meal revolves around the concept of pickling. To ensure the meat lasted and could be served cold without turning rancid, cooks often employed methods of heavily salting or pickling the cold Sunday leftovers. This not only preserved the meat for a day, but also made it intensely savory, requiring you to drink more of that watery tea or small beer afterward. It was a flavor profile dictated by preservation, not pleasure. Your stomach is already tight, not from nerves, but from the dull, predictable ache of the limited diet you're on. You probably won't survive this week without wanting to trade places with the cat. That's the reality check of Victorian domestic service. Hard, relentless work on an astonishingly low-calorie, low-variety menu, yet one that had to be cheap enough for the budget and filling enough for the punishing schedule. You chew slowly on your cold slice of beef, trying to muster the energy for the next few hours of hauling coal up the servants' stairs. This Monday meal perfectly encapsulates the divide between upstairs and downstairs. Both parties ate the same animal, but you eat the cold, unadorned remnants, while the family enjoyed the hot, freshly prepared spectacle. Historians still argue whether the perception of eating leftovers affected the servants' morale more than the actual nutritional content. Was it the feeling of being second class, served the cold, undesirable bits, that contributed to resentment? Or was it simply the repetitive, starchy nature of the overall diet? Either way, as you gulp down the last bit of potato, you remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we joked about. This is the dietary equivalent. Utilitarian, necessary, and deeply unglamorous. You quickly clean your own plate and cutlery, another task that saves the housemaid a job, and stand up, stretching the dull ache in your back. The afternoon calls for polishing the dining room silverware. The cold meat and potatoes will hopefully see you through. The cold, rigid efficiency of the Monday meal has set the pattern, and as you move into the heart of the working week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, your diet settles into an even deeper rut of filling but uninspired stews. The need to manage household budgets tightly meant that the cook couldn't afford fresh, prime cuts of meat every day, especially not for the staff. The kitchen operates on the principle of maximum caloric return for minimum expenditure, and nothing achieves this quite like a gigantic pot of simmering, slow-cooked stew. You approach the midday dinner table on Tuesday, and the heavy, earthy smell confirms your suspicion. It's stew day. The texture is thick, almost porridge-like, and the color is a dull, uniform brown or gray. This stew is built on two core components: a cheap, high-fiber bulk and whatever low-cost scraps of meat or bone the butcher sold off. For the bulk, think root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and especially large, misshapen carrots that weren't deemed aesthetically pleasing enough for the master's table. These vegetables are chopped roughly and boiled until they are utterly soft, dissolving slightly into the broth to create that desirable, thick consistency. There's also likely barley or perhaps dried peas and beans, which provide crucial protein and fiber and swell up massively during cooking, fooling your stomach into feeling full. You might even find some dried lentils, known for their ability to absorb the flavor of whatever they're cooked with, or in this case, the lack of flavor. The meat component is less glamorous. Forget tenderloin. You're looking at neck, shin, or flank. These are the cuts that require long, slow cooking to break down tough connective tissues, which makes them perfect for stew, but also means they are usually stringy and require serious chewing. Crucially, the cook often used bones in the stew. A mainstream historical fact is that boiling bones extracted gelatin, collagen, and vital minerals, and added a richness to the broth that masked the cheapness of the meat. You might find a joint bone or a marrow bone in the pot. The cook usually encourages you to suck the marrow out. It's pure fat, pure energy, a true luxury by servant standards. Every crumb, every scrap, every boiled potato was a matter of strict class division, a tangible measure of your place in the social hierarchy. The flavor of this midweek uninspired stew is entirely dependent on the cook's mood and skill. If the cook is competent and cares for the staff, she might throw in a few hearty herbs like thyme or bay leaf. If she is overworked or miserly, it's just meat, vegetables, and water boiled together for hours, seasoned only with basic salt and perhaps a splash of cheap vinegar for tang. It's heavy, it sits like a stone in your stomach, and it requires maximum energy input to consume. You eat it with a large metal spoon, careful to retrieve every tiny bit of meat from the vegetable morass. A quirky tidbit that sometimes surfaces in memoirs of former domestic staff is the trick of using savory puddings to bulk out the stew even further. This could be a sweat pudding or a basic flour and water dumpling boiled directly in the stew. These heavy, doughy balls were incredibly filling, acting almost like edible cement in your gut. They were a cheap way to satisfy the demanding appetites of men like the footmen or coachmen, whose physical labor was even heavier than the maids. You learn to prize the few lumps of fat that cling to these dumplings. Again, fat equals fuel. You spend the afternoon scrubbing floors, the steam from the hot water rising around you. That heavy stew is doing its job, providing a dense, steady energy release. But you also notice how few fresh green things you've eaten this week. No bright salads, no crisp apples. This lack of variety is what historians still argue, whether it was a deliberate economic choice or simply a reflection of the difficulty and expense of sourcing perishable produce like fresh fruit and soft greens for the downstairs kitchen, especially during the long, dark winter months. Regardless of the reason, your digestive system is essentially running on starches and rendered fat. As the late afternoon stretches on, you feel the need for another caloric spike. This is where you might sneak a piece of cold, leftover bread from breakfast, perhaps dipping it quickly into a cup of cooling tea. The tea itself is weak, often brewed from the cheapest dust leaves, but the warmth and the faint, sweet trace of cheap sugar, if you are lucky enough to get any, provides a brief psychological and energetic lift, helping you push through until supper, which is often just a small, light reprise of the breakfast menu. The stew has delivered its promise of energy, but the promise of enjoyment remains perpetually unfulfilled. You've survived the monotony of the midweek stew, and as you empty the chamber pots and polish the silver, your thoughts inevitably turn to the kitchen, the true heart of this immense house, and specifically to the cook. No one, absolutely no one, holds more immediate power over your day-to-day existence and your stomach's satisfaction than the woman in charge of the great coal range. The cook's power over your plate is absolute, a silent dictatorship built on dripping, salt, and the fear of waste. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I'm thinking about the servants who were probably clocking out right about now, around 11:30 p.m. after an 18-hour shift. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The head cook is typically a formidable presence, often one of the highest paid servants, rivaling the butler in prestige. She is the gatekeeper to the larder and the cellar. Every scrap of food that goes to the servants must be accounted for and budgeted, and the responsibility for this falls squarely on her apron-clad shoulders. If the cook is a decent sort, she ensures that the staff gets fair, if simple, portions, and uses her skill to make the cheap cuts and staples vaguely appetizing. If the cook is miserly, resentful, or simply a bad planner, your meals will be thin, watery, and barely enough to sustain the rigorous labor. Consider the distribution of the meat. When the butcher delivers the weekly order, the best cuts are earmarked for the family's dining room. The bones, offcuts, and cheaper joints are for the servants' hall. It is the cook who decides exactly which bone goes into the Tuesday stew and how much of that precious dripping is allocated to the bread. A mainstream historical fact about this hierarchy is that the kitchen staff themselves, the undercooks, the kitchen maids, and particularly the cook, often ate slightly better than the rest of the household staff, such as the housemaids, footmen, or stable hands, simply because they had immediate access to the food and could occasionally test the quality of ingredients intended for the master. This leads to a quirky tidbit about food politics in the Victorian kitchen. The cook's perks. Cooks often had unauthorized perks, such as being allowed to take home certain scraps or having a more generous allowance for tea and sugar. More controversially, there was the practice of perquisite taking, or outright minor theft. This wasn't always meat. Sometimes it was the fat that rose to the top of the broth, or the few eggs that were quietly designated as broken and therefore only fit for the staff. Lower-ranking servants would often try to curry favor with the cook, performing small errands or offering assistance in the scullery, hoping for an extra potato or a slightly thicker ladle of stew in return. This unspoken exchange system was a survival mechanism. The sheer volume of cooking required for a large Victorian household is staggering. The cook manages the main coal-fired range, which is perpetually hot, and oversees the preparation of two totally separate menus: the elaborate multi-course French-influenced meals for the family upstairs, and the simple, repetitive British staples for the dozens of people downstairs. Her success is measured by the silence from both tables. If the master complains about the sauce bechamel, she's in trouble. If the footman collapses from hunger, she's also in trouble. It's a tight, highly scrutinized job. You as a housemaid might catch a glimpse of the cook early in the morning, carefully examining the delivery from the fishmonger. Today is Thursday, leading up to Friday's traditional fish meal. She's checking the eyes and gills of the cod, not for the master, but for you. Bad fish could cause a serious outbreak of illness in the servants' hall, sidelining valuable workers, which is an inefficiency the master will not tolerate. The cook's vigilance is your protection, even if her generosity is limited. You pull on your heavy coarse uniform, the plain skirt, the thick apron, the cap if you are a female housemaid. The first task of the day is often lighting the fires or sweeping and dusting while the family still sleeps. You trudge down the narrow back staircase. Even before you get to the kitchen, you can smell it, the familiar, heavy, faintly metallic odor of the day's staple. It's the smell of cheap grain and boiling water, the smell of gruel. This is your breakfast. Historians still argue whether the extreme disparity in diet between the classes was primarily driven by economic necessity or by a deliberate social and moral policing of the working class appetite. Was the plain, heavy diet simply the cheapest way to deliver calories? Or was it also seen as morally correct? That servants, who were essentially paid laborers, did not deserve the sensual pleasure or the refined nutrition of their employers? You certainly feel the moral weight of the plain fare. It constantly reminds you of your station. You quickly pass through the main kitchen, avoiding eye contact with the cook, who is already directing a junior maid on how to prepare the tripe for the master's luncheon. You wish you had a tiny scrap of that tripe, a cheap, nourishing bit of offal that sometimes makes its way into the servant's dinner, but it appears today it's deemed fit for the family. You push the thought away. Your work is waiting, and wishing for better food is a luxury you cannot afford. You must remain energized, efficient, and above all, unseen. You've survived the grim uniformity of the midweek starch fest, and now as the week draws to a close, a subtle, historical rhythm asserts itself in the servants' hall. Today is Friday, and like almost every Friday in this household, regardless of the master's religious fervor, it's the day for Friday's fish and the religious connection. This tradition, stretching back centuries into Catholic practice, persisted even in heavily Protestant Victorian England, mainly because it was an ingenious way for household managers to save money. Fish, especially salted or dried fish, was a cost-effective alternative to meat. Think about it. Keeping meat fresh was a constant battle, relying on ice houses or heavy salting. But dried or smoked fish could be stored for weeks or months in the larder, making it a reliable and cheap staple. The two most common types to land on your servant's plate were cod or herring. A mainstream historical fact about the consumption of cod is that vast fleets sailed from British ports to the North Atlantic, bringing back huge quantities of salted and dried cod, known as salt cod or stockfish. It was incredibly cheap, packed with protein, and needed to be soaked for hours, sometimes overnight, to make it edible, reducing its intense saltiness. You watch the kitchen maids changing the water in the massive ceramic bowls where the cod is reconstituting. It smells powerfully of the sea and old salt, a scent that seems to cling to the walls of the basement kitchen. When it finally reaches your plate at the midday meal, it's usually boiled and served plain, often accompanied by those tireless, ever-present boiled potatoes. There is no delicate lemon butter sauce for you, not even close. If you're lucky, the cook might have added a bit of sharp vinegar to the boiling water to cut through the salt. This meal, while providing necessary protein, is intensely savory and requires constant sips of water or small beer, adding to the day's hydration, or lack thereof. If the cod was too expensive that week, or if the house was trying to economize even further, you might be served red herrings. These were cheap, heavily smoked and cured herrings, often packed in barrels. They were notorious for their strong, pungent smell and flavor, so much so that the smell could permeate the entire house, forcing the master to perhaps request dinner in his study. It sounds like something Dickens invented to make children cry. But for the average Victorian servant, gruel or porridge made from cheap oatmeal, or sometimes even coarser grains, was the absolute foundation of the day. It was warm, it was relatively easy to prepare in enormous communal batches, and most importantly, it was cheap. It filled you up fast, expanding in your stomach thanks to all that starchy fiber. This leads to the origin of the quirky tidbit. The phrase red herring itself, often used to describe a diversion, is sometimes historically linked to the practice of drawing a heavily scented smoked herring across a trail to distract hounds, showing just how potent the fish's smell was. You certainly noticed the scent following you up the stairs hours after the meal. The religious connection here is the historical tradition of abstinence from meat on Fridays, observed as a form of penance. Although the Victorian domestic staff weren't necessarily devout Catholics, the tradition stuck because it provided a perfect, socially acceptable justification for serving a cheaper, meatless meal once a week. It was a win-win for the household budget. You find yourself picking through the bony flesh of the herring, chewing carefully to avoid swallowing a sharp pin bone. This attention to detail is something you apply to everything in your work, from polishing the door knocker to eating your daily ration. Historians still argue whether the amount of salt consumed by servants due to preserved foods like salted fish and heavily salted dripping contributed to widespread hypertension and other health issues in the Victorian working class. You know only that you are perpetually thirsty after eating the Friday fare. The other staff members are eating in relative silence. The Fish Friday meal is generally considered the least appealing of the week, but you are thankful for the break in routine from the beef and mutton-based stews. As you finish, another kitchen maid rushes in, requesting you quickly run down to the cellar to fetch up the necessary bottles of sherry for the master's approaching evening dinner. You remember the taste of the bitter, salty fish, which acts as a strange and unappetizing palate cleanser before you head off to your next chore. The persistent, oily residue clinging to the roof of your mouth. You've endured the savory assault of Friday's fish, and as you prepare for the busy weekend, your mind turns back to the constant, greasy thread that runs through every meal. The role of dripping, the essential fat. It sounds utterly unglamorous, perhaps even a bit gross to modern sensibilities, but for the Victorian servant, dripping, the rendered, clarified fat from roasted beef or mutton, was a precious and absolutely necessary commodity. It was the backbone of the servant's calorie intake, a silent workhorse of the downstairs diet. Imagine the roasting pan under the great Sunday joint. As the meat cooks for hours, the fat melts and collects at the bottom. This fat is meticulously skimmed, strained, and then allowed to cool and solidify into a dense, creamy white or light yellow mass. This is dripping, and the cook guarded it fiercely. It wasn't just a byproduct, it was a key ingredient that served multiple vital functions in the servants' hall. Firstly, it was your primary spread. Remember your breakfast of stale brown bread? You didn't get butter, you got dripping. Slathered thickly onto the dense bread, it transformed a dry, hard carbohydrate into a filling, high-energy sandwich. It has a distinctly savory, beefy, or lamb-like flavor, a taste that becomes deeply comforting simply because it represents energy and satiety. It's the closest thing you get to a flavorful treat in the morning. Secondly, it was the main cooking medium. Instead of expensive lard or olive oil, which was almost unheard of in English kitchens except for specific high-end French cooking, dripping was used to sauté, fry, and roast any vegetables or scraps of meat allocated to the staff. It has a high smoking point and imparts a necessary richness to otherwise bland ingredients, like those boiled potatoes. Historians still argue whether the quality of the breakfast gruel changed significantly based on the region or the wealth of the household. Some wealthy homes use fine oatmeal, while poorer or more rural households might use barley or peas meal, making it heavy and almost aggressively bland. You don't get a choice in this matter, of course. You take the wooden bowl handed to you, perhaps a meager dollop of watery milk stirred in, or maybe just some salt for seasoning. A mainstream historical fact is that the sale of excess dripping was often a small, unrecorded bonus for the cook, or a minor way for the master to recoup some food costs, highlighting its financial value. The nutritional aspect of dripping is what made it essential. Servants, especially the footmen and coachmen performing heavy lifting, required thousands of calories daily. A simple starch-heavy diet of bread and potatoes wouldn't provide the sustained energy needed for an 18-hour shift. Dripping, being nearly 100% fat, offered a dense caloric punch that was easily stored, easily used, and provided that necessary slow burn throughout the day. You might even find yourself scraping the last bit from your plate and swallowing it quickly, knowing that every bit of that solidified grease is energy you'll need later when hauling coal up 4 flights of stairs. A quirky tidbit is the concept of poor man's butter. While dripping was the savory fat, sometimes rendered pork fat, lard, was mixed with a bit of salt and used as a slightly more palatable alternative, particularly in northern industrial towns where pig farming was common. The fact that the servants were getting a product specifically rendered from the master's roast was also a small, psychological comfort. It meant you were consuming something directly connected to the family's superior resources, albeit in a highly processed form. You are now in the late afternoon on Saturday, and you watch as a junior scullery maid is carefully stirring and straining a fresh batch of dripping that has solidified overnight. It's a job that needs attention, Any impurities left in the fat will cause it to go rancid quickly. This careful preservation speaks to its value. Historians still argue whether the quality of the dripping was consistent across all Victorian households. Did poorer households use fat that was less meticulously rendered, leading to a higher intake of impurities? Or was the process so vital that it was standardized? You only know that when the dripping tastes slightly burnt or has a faint, acrid smell, you have to try and ignore it because it's a non-negotiable part of your meal. You remember the cold, sticky feel of the fat on your palate from breakfast, the savory coating it leaves, and you accept it as the necessary grease of the machinery that is the downstairs workforce. It is fuel, pure and simple, devoid of luxury but rich in the one thing you need most: calories. You are now deep into the Saturday afternoon grind, the week's accumulated fatigue settling in your bones. You've seen how the cook controls the bulk of the food and how the quality diminishes with the cost. But the story is different again for the lowest ranking staff. Let's turn our attention to the plight of the scullery maid's hunger and hidden snacks. The scullery maid, or perhaps the boot boy, or the general utility man, occupies the bottom rung of the domestic ladder. This means they are often the last to eat, the first to be interrupted, and critically, their rations are often the smallest. They are typically young, sometimes just children, and their work is the dirtiest and most constant, washing endless piles of greasy pans, scrubbing floors, fetching and carrying.